Okay, so before this video begins, I just wanted to say that this was shot back in April, before I started doing YouTube as a full-time job. This was a conversation that Cody and I had such a long time ago, but then I started to transition into doing YouTube full-time, and I was trying to keep up schedule on the regular video essays that I was trying to get out every week, and I just could not find time to carve out editing for this, and then it just got away from me. It was one of those things where, like, I did it and then it sat on the back burner for way too long, but I'm back on schedule now, and I've finally gotten a hang on how I want to make my videos and how I handle the production every week. So I'm glad to finally get this done, but you will probably notice that I seem more nervous on camera here, and I am certainly less comfortable working without a script at this point. And I wanted to to just mention that at the start, because it is going to be very noticeable, but it was still a very good conversation, and I think especially Cody brought some really great movies to the table, so I still want to get this out there, and I hope that you all enjoy it, despite it being so late. But yeah, all right, here we go.
Good evening. My name is Cody Leach, and welcome to Rocklin Graves.
Beautiful. That was fantastic. All right. Welcome. I'm doing another sort of, not really an interview style thing, but me and Cody here, we're going to go through a list. We've each compiled 5 movies that we feel aren't necessarily underrated gems. I'm sure some of them will be, but ones that we don't feel like quite get the love that they deserve, whether they got talked about when they came out or not. If it doesn't feel like they got talked about quite enough or with quite enough love, we basically just want to shine a light on a couple of those. I'm still getting used to doing these unscripted videos, so I usually record with a teleprompter. So I'm not used to
totally
going off
different
script.
world.
It's completely different. I'm still trying to get used to it, but I don't see any reason to prolong further than just letting you introduce yourself. I don't think there's going to be any need for that, but we might as well anyway. So just give the people an idea of what you do.
All right. Well, as I said in the intro, my name's Cody Leach. I've been doing YouTube for about 7 years. I do a lot of movie reviews and movie rankings, but I also do some other little offshoot ideas here and there. I always say I have a focus on horror, but I talk about all genres. And I've been full-time for about 2.5 years now.
All right. Well, we're going to start off. I'll let you start off with your first movie, and then I'll throw mine, and we'll just go back and forth.
Okay. Pretty much mine are all underrated, like underknown gems. That's kind of where
I figured they would be, which is one of the reasons I reached out to you about this, because you have one of the broadest, like, list of movies that you've seen of anyone. So I figured that there would be some ones that I'll have to add to a list after this. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, these are my favorite movies to talk about. The ones that I feel like I'm introducing people to. That's always what I get my kicks off of. So so the first one, I'll get the non-horror one out of the way. And this one is a movie from, I think it's 1991. I'll double check. But it's called Gladiator. And it's not the one with Russell Crowe. Every time you say Gladiator, I'm like, oh, of course it's great. That's not underrated. What are you talking about? Gladiator is a movie with Cuba Gooding Jr., and it's a movie where you basically have this kid that moves into, I want to say it's Chicago. It's like a bad part of town, and he starts going to high school, and he finds out that people in this high school do this underground fighting, this underground boxing to get money. And he needs to get money to pay off his father's debts with this gambler. So he takes a fight, and, you know, not to spoil the first 15 minutes of the movie, but he knocks the living shit out of the current champion. And so suddenly Brian Dennehy is like the lead guy, the big bad guy who owns this little underground fighting ring. He becomes like the new champion, and he can't get out. So it's a really good, like, old school 90s boxing movie, but it also has like a little bit of crime thriller element into it. And there's some, you know, the themes of brotherhood and things like that. So I'm not going to say it's like Rocky level, you know, it's not that type of movie, but it's always been one of my favorites, a nostalgic movie that I think is pretty good, has a really good soundtrack. And if you like boxing movies that don't necessarily always lean into like the Oscar level drama, this is a really good one.
Hell yeah. That sounds awesome. I'm going to have to check that one out. And what year did you say it came out?
I think it's 1991. Let me double
91?
check. It's an older one.
Yeah.
1992. I was close.
Okay, so for mine, I'm also going to get the non-horror pick out of the way off the bat. So mine, I've picked Leave No Trace. This is a movie that's written and directed by Deborah Granick, who made Winter's Bone, which is a very early Jennifer Lawrence movie. Leave No Trace, part of the reason that I have such a soft spot for it is because of the context that I first saw it in. I was homesick in high school, and I was just browsing Netflix, and the poster looked cool. So I decided to check it out, and I was just blown away by it. It's a very sort of understated, slow burn movie about this relationship between a father and daughter who are homeless by decision of the father. And it's an interesting period in their relationship because she is getting to the age where she's starting to want to have a little more agency and is getting curious about this other side of the world. There's not many movies that are like structured in the way that it is, where we don't necessarily have like an antagonist in the movie. The people who you think would be antagonists in a movie like this, like social workers or policemen chasing them out of parks, they're all very sympathetic, and you can tell they're just trying to help these two in this odd situation that they're in. There's some backstory as to why he's chose to lead this life, but I won't get into that. I do think that the movie has the best silent interaction between two characters that I have ever seen. It's right at the end of the movie. There's this wordless interaction between them, and it's one of the most emotionally powerful moments I've seen. It's really incredible. It's starring Ben Foster. I always forget his last name. Ben Foster and Thomasin McKenzie, who was in Last Night in Soho. Really, really great movie. I highly recommend it to anyone who's into like sort of slow burn emotional dramas. And also check out Winter's Bone if you haven't seen her other film, because Deborah is a wonderful filmmaker.
Yeah, Ben Foster certainly piques my interest. He's usually a standout, even if he's the smallest role in the movie.
All right, let's move on to your second one.
All right, so this is one that is probably the most niche of any of the five here, which is probably part of the reason why it's always kind of gone under the radar a bit. It's called Trick or Treat, not the Trick or Treat, which is the anthology. This is a movie from 1986, and I'm
aware of this one. Yeah.
Yes, it's a heavy metal horror film that I grew up loving. It's my favorite movie soundtrack of all time, so that's pretty high praise. But it's a band called Fastway basically recorded an entire album that is the movie's soundtrack, and essentially it's very thick in mid 80s heavy metal culture, where you have, the side of the world that thought it's like devil worship, and the church evangelist television stars that are very against it. And this is back when they had like the PMRC that was trying to get rid of rock and heavy metal, and all they ended up accomplishing was putting the sticker on albums that said parental advisory, which just made sales skyrocket. So we win anyway. So Trick or Treat is about this kid who is very much the quintessential ostracized heavy metal nerd, where everybody picks on him and he's bullied, and he idolizes this one guy named Sammy Kerr, who is kind of like the Ozzy Osbourne character, I guess. And at the beginning of the film, the Sammy Kerr character dies in a hotel fire, and the main character gets a hold of this demo vinyl of his last unreleased record. And so when he plays it backwards, which was a thing back in the 80s, people used to play their records backwards and like interpret it as like messages. So he plays it backwards, and he actually is able to communicate with this heavy metal star from beyond the grave. And he helps him get back at his bullies and like get the hot girl in school, and then things start to go very sinister. It's cheesy, it's low budget, so I'm not going to say that it's held up the best without that added bit of nostalgia, but it's a really cool concept. Like I said, it's got a great soundtrack. You get cool little cameos in there from Ozzy Osbourne and Gene Simmons. And it's one of those movies that I think if somebody had the right passion for it, you could do a really cool like legacy sequel to it. Now that vinyls are starting to kind of become pop culture things again, get somebody that gets that vinyl record at like some weird, back room of a shop, and then they like are able to talk to Sammy Kerr in 2025 or whatever. So if I had the resources, I would fund that movie.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
It's one that I've been aware of, because Trick or Treat is one of my favorite movies, and every time I go to like Google something about it, I'll always end up having to go back and change something in the search, because that movie's the one that's coming up.
Yeah.
And it's piqued my interest a couple times, but now hearing you describe it, I'm gonna make a point of checking that out.
It's a fun one.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah.
So my next one isn't one that's unknown, but I don't feel like it quite gets enough credit for just how unique it was and how standout it was for me the first time I saw it, and that's The Night House from David
Okay.
Bruckner, Rebecca Hall. It's another sort of like slow burn ghost story, but what makes it so unique is the way that the movie builds up to this narrative where you're following along, and up to a certain point you're starting to feel like you have an understanding of what it is that's going on with this history with her husband who killed himself, which is the start of the movie. I'm not spoiling anything. That's the premise of the movie. There's a reveal that comes towards the end of the movie that, well, I mean, I didn't love how, like, the vehicle that they use to deliver it, it's a little on the nose. You kind of get a big, like, drawn out monologue sequence being like, here's what actually happened, which is a shame that that's how it gets revealed. But the content of what's being explained there was such a fascinating idea to me, as someone who's fascinated by narrative tools for the exploration of death. The way that this movie portrayed that was really cool to me. And Rebecca Hall, I mean, she's always fantastic. This was a standout movie for me, and one of the coolest things is this distinct visual style that it uses, where we have these dream sequences with like a blood red moon over this lake. And I mean, I'm a sucker for like lakeside horror in general, but there's so much like visual flair with it, especially in the way that they'll sometimes like use the architecture of a post in the house to create this sort of optical illusion, which you might know what I'm referring to. There's some really cool uses of that kind of stuff in that movie. It does get praised. Like, David Bruckner obviously is not an unknown director. He's making some really cool shit. But I just feel like for how unique that is within the haunted house genre, if you want to call it that, I don't feel like it gets talked about quite enough.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The thing that always stands out about that one, which is what you're kind of trying to convey there, is like, it boggles my mind to think of how you plan a shot where you just have like certain things in the background and the foreground of the shot, and you just have to move the camera to a certain point where it all lines up to give you this image.
It's
They
really
they might have
incredible.
used CGI in some of it, but it didn't seem like it. And
Yeah.
that's the beauty of it. Even if they did use it, they convinced me that they didn't. But yeah, it's an interesting one. It's very unique for sure. All right, so this is one that I think a lot of people know about it, but this falls more into the category it doesn't get the credit that it deserves for me, and that's Stir of Echoes, which is a film that Kevin Bacon is the lead star in. And this came out, I think 1999. I could be wrong about that, but around that area. And it's basically where he moves into this neighborhood with his wife and his kid, and he goes to a party, and they're messing around, everybody's drunk, and he gets hypnotized as like a party game, and it inadvertently like unlocks this like sixth sense where he's now able to like see and somewhat communicate with the dead. And there's something that has happened in his house to where there is this spirit that is lingering in his home. And it's part murder mystery, it's part psychological thriller, it's part haunted house film. For me, especially at the time, but I think it still holds up. It's genuinely scary. Like, there's moments where just images. It's not so like jump scares. It's more just like the visual of what you're seeing is very disturbing, and just the journey that he goes on as a character, as somebody who is initially very frightened and like just overwhelmed with discomfort about the situation, suddenly becomes infatuated with it to where he's almost discomforting and he's almost disturbing with his obsession with it, especially from his wife's perspective and the things that uncovers throughout it. It's a really cool movie that kind of got overshadowed by like Sixth Sense.
Sure.
So that's why I think it came out in 1999. It was around the same year where very much the Sixth Sense took the credit of that type of movie, and this
Right.
one just kind of was something that people rented and saw and forgot about.
I mean, so far I'm interested in all of these, and I'm glad, because I expected I wouldn't have heard of any of the ones that you were bringing up, and I'm glad that that's the case so far. So my next one is one that was under the radar for a long time, and then it has over the last couple of years started to get more attention. But the reason that I'm bringing it up is because, for whatever reason, there is this synergistic quality to all the different elements of this movie that make it, for me, the scariest thing I've ever seen. Which it's the only movie that ever made me feel like a child watching horror. Like, as an adult, feeling that same kind of like dread that you feel as a kid watching horror for the first time.
Interesting.
I'm sure you've heard of it. You've probably seen it. But I'm bringing it up because, particularly for me, there's just something that it makes me nervous to talk about, which is Lake Mungo.
I have not seen it.
You haven't seen it?
I have not seen it.
I'm curious to see what you would think about it, because it's not like Skinamarink, but it's that sort of like really slow burn, understated thing. There is a narrative in Lake Mungo, which is the big thing. It definitely helps. And there's a really compelling narrative. Have you heard of it?
I have heard the title. I don't know much beyond that.
Okay.
I get this one and Eden Lake mixed up in my head.
Right. Very different movies. Yes. So Lake Mungo is written and directed by Joel Anderson. It's an Australian mockumentary. Now, the thing about Joel Anderson is that since this movie came out, no one has been able to like track him down to talk to him about it. He's been very elusive. He was an executive producer on Late Night with the Devil, which was the first thing in a long time where we saw his name on something. He's like a ghost, which is fascinating to me, because to me, he came around, made the most bone-chilling thing I've ever seen, and then just vanished and never made another movie. The thing with Lake Mungo that I always have to specify when I'm talking about it is that it is a very specific kind of scary. There's like one groove that it fits into, and if you don't fit into that groove, you might still like the movie, but it's not going to be like viscerally terrifying. So I try not to set like a bad expectation for it for people going in, because I think that most people who watch it are not going to find it scary. And I think that because most people I've shown it to haven't found it scary. They've liked it. They've all been like, this is really good. But the only other person that I've shown the movie to who has had the same reaction to it that I did was my brother. So that, says something. It's something in our blood. Essentially what the movie's about is there's a family whose daughter drowned, which is how the movie starts out. This is not a spoiler. It's literally the opening scene of the movie is them explaining this. And it explores the circumstances surrounding what happened on that day, because they don't know exactly how it is she drowned. But then throughout trying to learn about this, they're also unveiling more things about her that they weren't aware of, and different people in the local area start coming forward with new bits of information. And it's the one movie where every time I watch it, I've forgotten that I'm watching a movie. Like, I always feel like I'm watching an actual documentary, which is largely in part to the very reserved way that they portray grief. You don't have people just like on screen bawling their eyes out all the time. When you're watching these interviews with her parents and her brother, it feels like actual people who are talking about the loss of someone that they cared about. Then we also have images that were taken and video clips that are resurfaced that are shown to us throughout the movie, where they do a very good job of drawing your eye to one part of the frame and going, here's the bad thing that we're pointing out to you. And then later in the movie going, that wasn't actually anything. The real thing is over in the corner and you just didn't notice it. And they're completely correct. And it's bone-chilling to realize the things that are going on in the background while we think we're getting useful information about what's happening. It's very hard to talk about without spoiling it, because it's incredibly narrative-driven. But there's one scene towards the end of the movie that is the most frightened I have ever been watching a movie, which is super exciting to me. And I watched it twice the first day I saw it, because I was like, I have to do that again immediately. And I've seen it like 7 times total.
That's awesome.
And it's continually interesting and exciting. And the less I get scared of it, because I'm just watching it over and over again, the more fascinated I am by the world and the characters and the way it's telling its story. It is one of 2 things that I am just intimidated to make a video about, because I don't know how to do it justice. It's that and Mike Flanagan's Haunting of Hill House.
I know that very well.
Yeah. Lake Mungo and Haunting of Hill House, the Mike Flanagan series, are the 2 things where I'm just like, I just don't know how to like tackle this.
It's hard. Like that's when people, like, I do a review series, and like I'm doing John Carpenter. I've been doing it for like a year. I'm dragging my ass with it. But when I get to things like The Thing that are like my favorite thing ever, it's like, what do I say? It's the weirdest thing where you could talk for hours about movies that don't mean nearly as much to you, but you 100%. Get one that's really close to home, and suddenly you're like tongue tied. Like, what's the right thing to do? I don't know.
Yeah, and then I recently sat down to try and start writing a video about Lake Mungo, and I wrote a 1,000-word intro to it before even getting to the actual movie itself. So it's like, how am I going to make this work? I'm very glad to hear that you haven't seen it. Actually, I think you should check it out.
Okay, yeah, I'm interested.
I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on it.
All right, so I might pull an audible. Have you seen the film Frailty?
No.
You have not? Okay, never mind. I'm not going to pull an audible. So this is always one of my picks, and I did a review on it a couple months ago and titled it "The Best Movie You've Never Seen." And the most popular comment was, "Everybody's seen this. What are you talking about?" So I was like, maybe it's not underrated. I don't know. But yeah, this is a film called Frailty. So this is the directorial debut of Bill Paxton. Rest in peace. And basically, it's a story. He plays the main character, the father, where these two boys are, they're raised by a single father, and he's just a kind of regular, lovable, everyday Joe. And then he wakes them up in the middle of the night in like the first 10 minutes of the film and says, "God has come to me with a message. There are demons among us. The apocalypse is coming, and he has tasked us with destroying demons. And he's going to give us a list of names." And so one kid immediately buys into it, the younger one, the more impressionable one, and the older one's like, "Dad's lost his mind," and thinks that it's just kind of a joke and plays it off until his dad brings somebody home one night for them to murder. And so it's essentially that it's one brother not believing in his father, not believing in this task from God that they're supposed to be killing people, and another son that absolutely buys into it. And it's just such a crazy concept. It's such a wild movie that is Bill Paxton intentionally does this old school form of directing where it's almost like a classic horror film where they really don't show you a whole lot. You just kind of see it through the reactions of everybody in the scene. And it's all the more effective for that. And it's also one of the only films I can think of that has multiple twist reveals, and every one makes the last one better. Like usually you get a movie where one twist, maybe two, and then if they try to go beyond that, something ends up unraveling and it just doesn't, it kind of loses you. And this is one where like literally the last 15 minutes of the movie is like twist, 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 and you're just like, holy shit. And so it's a movie that kind of flew under the radar when it first came out, and I've always championed it. And anybody I talk to, with very few exceptions, that has seen it thinks of it the same exact way, but it's one of those movies that just the masses, for whatever reason, don't really know about.
That sounds so fucking cool.
Oh, it's awesome. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, honestly. It's really good.
Okay, well, out of any of them, I'm watching that first. That sounds so cool.
Yes, that's a good one.
Now, this one I feel like you've probably seen. I'm picking The Cursed.
Yeah.
I fucking love werewolf movies, and we don't get them super often. What's really cool about The Curse, and it was originally titled 8 for Silver, which is a much better name.
Yes.
It's a really interesting take on werewolves because it's not the standard, like, werewolf haunting a small village and picking people off slowly. There's some cool things that they do with the lore of what we understand in lycanthropy, if you want to call it that I found really interesting. And what really struck me is that it was a low budget movie. I don't remember exactly what the budget was, but they shot on film, which is very rare for something of its budget, and it looks absolutely beautiful. There's so many moments in that movie where I feel like I'm looking at a painting of like the English countryside, which was not something I was expecting going, because I didn't know anything going into the movie. I hadn't even seen a trailer, and I went on a whim and was so taken by the visual style of it. The one thing I don't love about it is how they shoot the action scenes. It's just like really jittery, almost like Jason Bourne looking, which clashes a lot with the sort of slow moving cinematography from the rest of the movie, which I think was probably part of the budget thing. They were trying to, like, their design of the beast itself probably wouldn't have translated all that well if we're not shaking it around a ton, but it looks a little weird. It's not like the greatest movie of all time, but it was just a really interesting twist on the werewolf thing. There's some really cool practical effects in it that I thoroughly enjoyed, and some great like haunting imagery. If you like foggy countryside horror shit. You're gonna dig it.
Yeah, this is one that I actually saw at Sundance whenever it premiered. Or
Oh,
it
no
was
way.
Sundance at home. It was during
It was called
2020.
Eight for Silver then, wasn't it?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And it drove me up a wall that they changed the title because that's such a better title. I think
Yeah.
overseas it's still called Eight for Silver, but for whatever reason in America they wanted to call it The Cursed, as if that's not the most like bland title you
I
can come up
know.
with. But yeah, it was funny because this was actually my first film festival experience, and it was like all digital where they just told you the times and you just logged in and watched a few films. And I only had the time to watch 5 films, and of the 5, this was unfortunately the only one that I even liked. But I really liked it, and so I came away
Yeah.
from it like really hyping it up. If you can go back on my channel and there's a review for it like a year before the movie even came out that almost nobody watched because nobody knew what the hell I was talking about. But what I liked about it was, yeah, it kind of goes for like that Robert Eggers, like the witch kind of vibe in the first half or so. So when they're doing the things that they're doing to like the gypsies, and it's like really
It's
visceral and
fucked up.
shocking and
Yeah.
fucked up. You're like, whoa! And then that's even before werewolf stuff comes into it. And I haven't seen
Hell
it
of a way to open
unfortunately
a movie.
since Sundance, but I remember there being some really cool little twists on the werewolf lore and like how you turn into the beast. And it's a cool one for sure. There's not
Yeah.
many werewolf films. Like I found this out whenever I did a ranking of vampire and werewolf films a year ago, and I'm like, there's so many better vampire films than there are werewolf ones. It's a shame. But this is the best one probably in the last decade or so, at least. All right, so my number one is a film called Session 9. Have you ever seen it?
No, but I was planning on doing a video on it fairly soon, actually.
Okay, cool. So
My
this
cousin
is
recommended it to me recently.
yes, this is absolutely one of those underseen, underrated movies. Now, it's a TV movie, so there are certain things about it that you certainly see, like some budget limitations, especially with some of the sound design. There's like almost like a Wilhelm scream, like a couple of times in the movie that you could tell is like that didn't even sound real. But that aside, it's a really atmospheric movie. Like if I try to think of a film that chills you to your bone just based off of the atmosphere, I don't know if there's one that does it better than this one. Where you have this asbestos cleanup crew that goes into this abandoned asylum and they have a week to clean it out. And shit starts to happen. And there's one of them where the movie gets the title from. There's one of these guys that finds these collections of old tape recordings of like a psychiatrist or the doctor talking to one of these inmates when there was people in this asylum, and there's 9 tapes, 9 sessions, and each one is basically this person having a different personality, and it gets more and more eerie and disturbing as it goes along. And so it's just a movie that to me it sets up some really good old school classic scares because it is such a low budget film. Like one, for example, there's this underground tunnels that they're in where they have these string lights so that they can see. And they're trying to clean the asbestos out of these tunnels where there's a scene where a guy's all the way in the back of the tunnel and the lights start to go out. And so there's literally a scene where he's hauling ass trying to get out of it and the darkness is like coming for him as the lights are shutting down. So it's just really good old school simple scares, which I crave nowadays. And as I said, not to repeat myself, it's just such an atmospheric movie that it's always stuck with me. And there's certain things about the voices on these tapes, especially the ones that close out the film that just like they just like chill your spine to where you end the movie and you're like, I gotta watch a Disney movie to like bring
Right.
me back before I go to bed.
I was out with my cousin recently, and the reason that he brought it up was because he was doing air quality control work,
Hmm.
and there was a building that was being demolished. I think it was an old school that he had to go into, suit it up, but it was abandoned. And he said that he had just watched Session 9
Oh God.
and just couldn't stop thinking about it because it was pitch black in there because it was a big building and they didn't have windows everywhere.
Hmm.
So he's walking around with like nothing but the headlamp to
Oh
light him
God.
down these like dingy,
Nightmare
dilapidated
fuel.
hallway. Yeah, yeah. So he was like, "This is reminding me of this movie you have to see." So,
Yeah. Well, I'll just set the stage for you for how terrifying that probably was for him because the movie, one of the first things that happens when they go into this asylum is like they go into this big open hall and there's just nothing but decrepit old brick and like papers everywhere. And there's this chair that was clearly meant to confine somebody that's all rusted and torn up in the background. And the guy's
Okay.
looking at it and you just hear, and like, what the fuck? And then so like that's how it all starts. And so,
Right.
like I could just imagine him walking through and like,
Okay, so for my last one, this is the only one that I think is actually a hidden gem, because most of the ones I'm talking about are not like unknown movies. This one is fairly unknown. This is The Righteous from writer-director Mark O'Brien. You ever seen this one?
I have not.
You haven't. So this was one of those ones where I was in Sunrise Records, which is where I just go to find random Blu-rays. And they had this sitting on the shelf. I had no idea what it was, but the cover was cool. And the inside of the box art was even cooler. So I bought it, not knowing a thing about it. And it is such a fascinating movie. So Mark O'Brien is an actor who had this idea for a movie that sort of feels like a play. The premise basically is there's this older couple who are living in their house. It's kind of isolated in the woods a little bit. The man, he's a priest who's kind of struggling with his faith. And then there's a young man who shows up on his front porch injured and is looking for help. And after kind of, feeling the situation out a bit, he brings the man in and they basically start nursing him. What makes it so interesting is that it gets to a point where you're going, all right, I kind of have an idea of what they're doing with this. And then there's a moment where it kind of flips on its head and it twists what could have been a very generic horror trope into something that is so conceptually fascinating and opens up some really interesting paths for them to take the story down. Not going to spoil it because it's really, really cool what they do with this setup. And the longer it goes on and the more we learn about who this man is that showed up on their porch, it gets kind of more and more out there and very symbolic, but it ties together in such a beautiful way by the end of the movie. It's not like directly scary. It's just really damn interesting. It's a slow burn, and it often feels like a play because Mark O'Brien did a lot of, like stage acting. But you can also tell that he's very competent behind the camera because his shot composition is just beautiful. A lot of it, again, looks like a painting, which is something that I'm always really drawn to in filmmaking. It was one of those ones where like you never hear anyone talk about it. And then I had one comment where someone was like, hey, you should check out this movie, The Righteous. I was like, all right, I'm doing a video now. Yeah. Because I've been wanting to do this anyway. One request was all it took. And I'm excited too, because it's a fascinating movie. I definitely recommend checking it out. All right. Well, I think that's 5, eh?
Yeah.
We made it through.
That's 5.
Awesome.
Unless you got 5 more.
Well, I'm sure the more you bring up, the more fascinated I am. Just hear you. You're gonna have to send me a list of like recommendations or something, man. All right, dude. Well, yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. This has been really fun for me. I'm trying out some different things on the channel aside from the video essay style stuff, just to diversify a little bit. And it's cool that you agreed to do this. I appreciate it.
No problem. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.